So in chapter 15 of Chronicles, we are dealing here mostly, or really entirely, with the movement of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And David is going to place certain people over certain leadership positions, and that is really the entirety of the chapter. Because of the nature of the chapter, there's quite a bit of lists, so we're not going to read the entire thing. We'll just kind of comment along as we've been doing. And so let's just go ahead and start here with one of the early verses, with verse 1. We'll probably go to about verse 3 or 4. So David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said that no one but the Levites may carry the ark of God, for the Lord had chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister to him forever. And David assembled all of Israel at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to its place, which he had prepared for it. And David gathered together the sons of Aaron and the Levites. Of the sons of Kohath, Ariel, the chief, with 120 of his brothers, and it's going to break off into one of these kind of roll calls. And so we'll just kind of jump off there and comment along. So first, we want to note here the language of prepared. David prepared this place for the ark of God. And Johnstone, in page 181 of his commentary, he says, amid the bustle of the repair and extension of Jerusalem, that was in 1 Chronicles 11, David prepared a place for the ark of God. This phrase virtually provides a title for the next two chapters. It includes not only the structure indicated in the next phrase, and pitched a tent for it, but also the organization of the personnel and their functions as ministrants. The tent is a special one for the purpose and not to be confused with the tent of meeting, which is about to be pitched at Gibeon. And also noting on this language in a footnote, Merrill notes that this verb here, it's KWN, the consonants. So he says the verb here used for prepare is better translated established or determined in this and other contexts. Otherwise, it speaks of the foundation of the earth, the Davidic dynasty, steadfastness of Israel's heart, specifically or especially prepared timber, Rehoboam's kingship and that of Jehoshaphat, the weapons and armaments, service of the temple storerooms, and preparation for the Passover. I think that's pretty significant. So this language is kind of interesting. There's, as he notes here, it's the Chronicles employment of the verb is remarkable in that it seems he wishes to make the point that what was done by David and his legitimate successors was firm and final. Continuing here, the Ark of God. Scott Hahn notes in page 57 and 58 of his commentary that David is portrayed as both Israel's king and its chief priest. He is clad as the Levites are in a fine linen robe and an ephod. This is actually pretty interesting because you'll read quite a bit in the commentaries. Some want to really downplay David's role as priest, and because there are slight differences, obviously, if you've read through any of the kingdom books, Samuel, there's some of this language in this verse in particular, or this narrative in particular, is a little bit different, and so some will highlight those differences and wonder about, is the chronicler like downplaying some of David's priestly activities in this and some of the other passages. But as he notes here, and I think he's going to note it further down, David is also wearing an ephod, which is a very priestly idea. So I think that the differences between language shouldn't be seen as this theological, possible, like almost polemic idea against David as a priest. I don't think that that's what's going on, especially when you take into account the fact that David keeps getting these motifs, like these Melchizedek type motifs. It's like, that's the first priest in the Bible. It's hard to, at least the first explicit one, I would say David or Adam is. But the fact that it's being portrayed as a new Adam and as a new Melchizedek, I think that just is a slam dunk that he's being portrayed as a priest in places. So I don't think that language we shouldn't focus too much on that language. I just bring that out though, because you will read that in some of the commentaries that some will try to downplay David as priest, and I just think that that's unnecessary. Anyway, continuing on with Han, he says, elsewhere in Scripture and later rabbinic tradition, this garb is associated with the vestments of Aaron, the high priest. In another priestly move, David officiates in the sacrificial offering of 7 bulls and 7 rams. Although the chronicler paints a similar picture of shouting and jubilation, it is probably just a coincidence that the only other place where this specific kind of offering is made is in conjunction with Balaam's prophetic word. The Lord their God is with them, and the shout of a king is among them. That's Numbers 23:21. And you have similarly 7 offerings in Numbers 23:1. Of course, this is where further down he's going to speak about the I see him but not yet, the star language that is very messianic in its nature. So I think that it may not actually be a coincidence that we share that same vocabulary, and the only times we have these specific 7 offerings used. But anyway, continuing on, here further down, where commenting on David gathering together the sons of Aaron, and then it's going to go into this long roll call. Lightheart has a very interesting note. He notes that the total number of Levites is 862, which happens to be the gematria of tabnit, the word for pattern, in tabernacle and temple texts. The priests form the pattern for the house under Yahweh's inspiration. David forms a human temple of living stones. I want to actually look at the passage so you know what we're talking about here. So Exodus 25:9. This is when God is speaking to, I think specifically speaking to Moses. They're dealing with contributions for the sanctuary, and specifically this one goes right into the Ark of the Covenant. So significantly, that's what we're dealing with here. And he says, this is God speaking to them. He says, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all its furniture, so shall you make it. It's this term right here, pattern. And this is a very significant idea if you've ever tracked on it. But again, the Hebrew value for this term. In fact, this is pretty cool. Logos actually has this tool, like a gematria tool, which is pretty cool. Probably the easiest way to do it would be to click out to it. We'll copy it and paste it here. And there we go. 862. So as you can see here it gives you the math and how they break down each letter. And so you see the value of this term. And of course, again, to Lightheart's point, if you were to count up all these people, which I've done before, you get 862 explicitly brought in. Anyway, continuing on. And here on page 182 and 83, John Stone in his commentary has a nice, it's almost like a nice summary of this chapter and some of the surrounding themes that we've been dealing with in some of the previous chapters. So he notes here, the basic theme of Chronicles is touched upon once again. The whole of Israel's life is to be sanctified by being disposed around the ark in the center in great concentric rings of ever-heightened holiness, as that center is approached. In the innermost circle, where the ark itself stands, where the Lord of hosts is enthroned above the cherubim, only those who have been specially set apart can presume to enter. And I can't help but pause here and again point out something I pointed out earlier, that this changes dramatically in the New Testament. The idea of boldly approaching the throne of God. I mean, that's not something you did in the Old Covenant, Old System. You had to be specifically set apart for that. But in the New Testament, we're all, the kingdom of priests kind of idea, because your body is the temple idea. The Spirit that once dwelt in the Ark of the Covenant dwells in believers. So therefore, they can approach. So it's just something we're thinking about. Anyway, continuing on. For this awesome moment, those sanctified representatives of the people must again sanctify themselves by ablution abstinence in Exodus 19:10 and verse 15, and sacrifice, Exodus 29. The root here, that's QDS, it's like a Kadesh, that kind of stuff, or Kadosh. So typical of Chronicles vocabulary is here used again for the first time in the narrative section. Is referring here to, well, it's the term here, I'm pretty sure consecrate is, that's what he's referring to. And he's saying it's the first time in the narrative section this is brought up, because it was brought up earlier in the genealogy section. With the verb PRS, again, the break forth language, the breakout. Remember, parazaza, again, all of that stuff in chapter 13, 14, there was kind of that theme, that running theme of God breaking out against, or really it started with David. David broke out with a plan. The Lord breaks out against the people because they they don't respect the holiness of God. So God breaks out against them. And then David later is going to break out against his enemies when he consults with God. And now again, they properly are doing things. But again, this language is being brought up again here with the verb break forth in verse 13. The grim reminder of Perez Uzzah incident, of the Perez Uzzah incident of chapter 13 is made. For the ultimate purpose is that, in contradistinction to previous practice, the Lord may be resorted to. And again, he's going to pick up the language here of seeking guidance. That we got that a lot. That this is what Saul failed to do, and on some level, David did to a lesser degree. But now they're properly seeking God. Only by the punctilious observance of the procedures as revealed by God to Moses can the ark be properly handled and God fitly consulted. In obedience to the king, it is these procedures that the Levites now fulfill to the letter for the carrying of the ark by poles on the shoulders of the Levites. And here he has the number of places where specifically they're told that this is how they're supposed to carry the ark this way, which of course they failed to do in chapter 13. Johnstone notes this, and again, I couldn't help but bring it out, that he says that these three leaders here, he was talking about Heman and Asaph and Ethan, sound the cymbals in verse 19. But he's making this point, though. He says, along with them are there 14 instrumentalists of the second rank, also termed gatekeepers in verse 18, 8 playing lutes and 6 playing lyres. I just thought that was interesting. Again, if you followed along, the 14 associated with David, the value of his name. Again, not to make too much of it, but it's just every time it seems to keep popping up, 14 in these lists. It's just kind of interesting. And similarly, on this note, with in the same section, Leithart in page 53 says, the text is a complicated, repetitive list, but has an order to it. 3 sections punctuated by references to gatekeepers. The numerology is dense. There are a total of 70 gatekeepers, which is the number of Gentile nations in Genesis chapter 10, and the number of Israel when it represents the Gentiles in Exodus 1:5. So if you were to count up this is the table of nations. If you count up all the names, you get 70. There were connections with like 70 offerings on certain things. And as well as in the New Testament, Jesus sends out not 12 disciples, because the 12 is associated with the tribes, right? He actually sends out 70 disciples at one point. This is Luke. Oh God, I think it's Luke 10 or 11. It's where this is when Jesus says to them, "I saw Satan fall like lightning." But again, it's symbolic of sending out the disciples to reclaim all the nations. But again, so we have 70 gatekeepers here, but there are 17 names in the first list, the gematria of kavod, glory. It's also the value of the divine name Yahweh. Yahweh is enthroned within his radiant glory. Now he comes to be enthroned in the musical glory of Israel. When the 7 priests are added, we have 24 and a chief, Chenaniah. That anticipates the eventual structure of the priesthood with its 24 clans and a single high priest, as well as the organization of the Levitical singers into the permanent structure of 24 groups. And I also can't help but think of the 24 elders in Revelation. And if you want to add a chief among the 24, I suppose you could think of that as the Lamb or Jesus. But just kind of interesting. And I wanted to note this because there's a lot of, if you've ever looked at this stuff and studied it, there's a lot of questions about some of the musical terminology in the Bible, because it's just, nobody knows for sure, right? So, but if you want a little bit on some of that, referencing, this here, you have these guys, Obed-Edom again, Jael, Azaziah, were to lead with lyres according to the Sheminith. So it's like, well, what is that? I think this is the InterVarsity Press Bible background commentary. They say, referencing some of this language here, the musical stuff, the terms Alamoth used in the titles of Psalm 46 with a possible variation in Psalm 48:14, and the title to 9 and Sheminith, Psalm titles 6 and 12, are left untranslated in the NIV. That was the text they're running with, because, and of course it's true for our text here, there's still uncertainty concerning their technical meanings. The former term in its non-technical use means maidens, and is therefore sometimes interpreted as being in the soprano range. The latter term means eighth, and is thought to suggest a certain placement on the octave. Akkadian texts demonstrate the knowledge of the 7-note scale and various keys or tunings. Some of the Akkadian notations also concern the intervals used for filling out the chords, for example, thirds, and so on and so forth. But it's just something that's kind of interesting. And the this would be interesting too. The idea of if the eighth is a reference to like the octave musically, because somebody left a comment in one of the Gematria videos where he was bringing out some of the eighth stuff, which it was kind of interesting because if you don't know this, the value of Jesus' name is actually in Greek is 888, right? So it's 3 8s, and there's a lot that kind of goes into that, and especially like in Revelation, you get a bunch of sevens, right? That's very well known, but so many of those sevens have an implied eighth, right? So you have like 7 thunders, but then you have God's voice like thunder, which to me, as somebody that's somewhat musically inclined, I can't help but think of those implied eighths as an octave, because the octave is the first note again, but higher up the register or whatever. But anyway, if anybody's into music stuff, it's just some stuff we're thinking about. Chenaniah is an interesting figure. There's a lot going on here. Let me pick up with Lightheart's commentary on page 54, right? So there's this guy here, one of the guys, he's actually the chief. Chenaniah, leader of the Levites in music, should direct the music, for he understood it. That's the phrase. Now, believe it or not, there's a lot there's a lot to think about in that short little phrase. Lightheart says, Chenaniah's role is puzzling, and his name means Yah or Yahweh is gracious. He is a prince, literally, or Tsar, which is literally prince, of the Levites, who is skillful and gives direction in Massa. So this Massa term generally means, he's going to go ahead and point it out here in the Torah, the term is used to refer to the physical labor of transporting or bearing the tabernacle. It usually means something more like lifting, right? So Chenaniah, leader of the Levites in lifting, should direct the lifting, for he understood it, right? That's usually the way you would think of it. Now, the reason why people tend to look at it from a musical perspective is, well, the assumption is that what's being lifted up is voices and music and that kind of thing. So he says, right, so the term is typically referring to the physical labor of transporting the tabernacle, but in 1 Chronicles 15, it has to do with music. It is one of a number of priestly and Levitical terms that take on new meanings. The physical bearing of the ark is transformed into the work of bearing up Yahweh's throne in song. So we'll pick back up in verse 25. So it says, so David and the elders of Israel and the commanders of the thousands went to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the house of Obed-Edom with rejoicing. And because God helped the Levites who were carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord, they sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams. David was clothed with a robe of fine linen, as also were all the Levites who were carrying the ark. And the singers, and Chenaniah, the leader of the music of the singers, and David wore a linen ephod. So all Israel brought up the ark of the Lord, or the ark of the covenant of the Lord, with shouting to the sound of the horn, trumpets, and cymbals, and made loud music on harps and lyres. As the ark of the covenant of the Lord came to the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David dancing and celebrating, and she despised him in her heart. And that is the end of chapter 15. But let's go back up here and let's deal again with some of the stuff. Han he's going to make the connection here with Melchizedek. So he says in page 58 and 9, the chronicler has also tapped into some deeper biblical tradition of royal priesthood. David's actions can be well understood as reflecting his aspirations to be a new Melchizedek. That's kind of what we were hitting on earlier. Before this procession, there is only one biblical precedent for a righteous king's performing priestly functions: the mysterious Melchizedek of Salem. And again, remember, that's Jerusalem, who brought out bread and wine and blessed Abraham in Genesis 14. Melchizedek is the first person to be designated priest in the canon. According to later Jewish interpreters, he represents the divine ideal of priesthood. So Philo, Josephus. Melchizedek appears again in the Hebrew canon only once more in a powerful Davidic tradition. In Psalm 110:4, he is the namesake of the eternal order of priesthood, bestowed along with divine sonship upon the Davidic king by a divine oath. The Lord has sworn, you are priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Later Jewish tradition attaches much symbolic significance to Melchizedek's name, which means king of righteousness. The name of his kingdom, Salem, which denotes peace. For instance, both of these concepts are operative in the chronicler's depiction of Solomon. However, the key biblical link between Melchizedek and David and the Davidic kingdom remains Psalm 110:4. So the point is that there's quite a bit that hooks back to Melchizedek and David acting in these priestly functions, wearing an ephod, so on and so forth. Continuing on with Han. In page 60, on Melchizedek, the ark, David as a new Adam, he says, recalling the royal and priestly imagery employed in the creation accounts and reading in light of the Davidic hope expressed in the Psalms and prophets. In the chronicler's David, we see not only a new Melchizedek, but also a new Adam. Or perhaps better, in the chronicler's David, we see a new Adam by way of Melchizedek. With the ark established at Zion, the God Most High, El Elyon, the maker of heaven and earth, sits enthroned above the nations, ruling through his firstborn, the highest of the kings of earth, Psalm 89, verse 27, who is priest and king. The association of David and Melchizedek, like the identification of the temple and Moriah, serves to plant the kingdom of God at Zion, deep in the soil of ancient pre-Israelite history of the world. Jewish tradition overwhelmingly identified Melchizedek with Shem, the righteous firstborn of Noah, an interpretive tradition that continued in early Christianity. That makes Melchizedek a representative of this era of natural religion, when the priesthood was rooted in patriarchal family structure. Continuing further down to this language, in verse 27, David was clothed with a robe of fine linen. Johnstone in page 188. David is here the chief priest, the intermediary between his people and God. He is clad in the priestly garment of linen. And he's noting here that the robe here, as you see here, he says it's tempting to see a deliberate pun on Ma'al, which was our term for, like Saul, he committed a Ma'al, however that's translated in various passages, but a trespass or something to that effect. He says one derivation of Ma'al being from Ma'il, cloak, that is covering, masking true motives, just as the synonym means both garment and treachery. Now, this is really interesting because I had noted this in chapter 10 when we talked about Saul, and I noted there at the end of that video that Saul loses his armor at the end when he's killed, and I point out that that's a motif that began in Samuel of Saul repeatedly losing clothes, where David is repeatedly gaining clothes. And you'd have to watch the end of that video, and I talk a little bit about that. I didn't go into great depth, but I just point out that is a motif that happens. But I forgot to mention one part of that motif that is really interesting, because Saul does gain clothes in one, or he puts on new clothes in one particular narrative, and it's here in 1 Samuel 28, where he goes to meet the witch of Endor. And here it says, so Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, and two men went with him, right? So he's going to go meet this witch, this medium. And this term here for garments, let's see if I can click on it. As you can see here, this is the same word that they're referring to over here. As you can see, there's actually a 2 by the Hebrew word, and what that means is that there's another Hebrew word with the exact same letters. But if we click out to it, as we can see here, one of those words is treachery, the other being clothes, wardrobe, stuff like that. So it's the same word, means two totally different things, seemingly. But think of it that way. So a Hebrew reading person would look at this passage and see that he disguised himself and he puts on treachery. Of course, he is putting on garments, but that word, like, you would see both words when you look at that. And so it would create that verbal link. There's kind of something like this going on, except it's kind of the reverse of that. And we got a little bit of this in the last chapter. with some of the Ma'al language being possibly used as a pun. The highly exalted, the lifted up kind of language, and the way that was used as a pun. And it's basically pointing out it could be here. Same kind of thing could be going on here, but I felt that was worth noting because I didn't touch on that in the in 1 Chronicles 10. I didn't get to that point that Saul does actually gain clothes in one story, but he's putting on treachery in that story. But continuing further, while the robe elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible is recognized as being worn principally by members of the royal family, it is one of the holy garments worn by the priesthood and to set them apart. And he gives the references there. David is indeed dressed as a priest is made unambiguous by the reference at the close of the verse to his wearing an ephod, a vestment worn above this robe by the priest, again described in Exodus 28. Now, again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning of all this, or earlier in this video, that there are those scholars, commentators, that want to downplay David being a priest, but it's hard to avoid it because he's wearing an ephod. And even if it's like, for instance, because this is what they'll note is that, well, this robe is more of royal family attire. It's generic. It's not necessarily high priest robes and stuff like that. It's like, okay, but he's wearing an ephod. So how do you it's just, I don't know why they resist it so much. But anyway, the wearing of the ephod expresses clearly the mediatorial role of the wearer. On the two stones attached to the ephod, as described in Exodus 28, 9 through 12, were engraved the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, which were thus carried on his very garments by the priest as he approached God. Equally, the ephod, through its association with the sacred lots of Urim and Thummim, was part of the essential means whereby God communicated his divine guidance to his people. For example, 1 Samuel 23, 9 through 12, both by bringing in the ark and by wearing the ephod, David was resorting to the Lord for guidance in the most complete ways possible. In contrast, that was Saul. Only through such a figure with direct and immediate access to God can the ideal of Israel's vocation to be the people of God be realized. Again, we'll pick up here in some of the all of Israel in verse 28. So all of Israel brought up the Ark of the Covenant with the Lord with shouting, so on and so forth. Han notes in page 58, certainly the chronicler is here continuing the new Moses theme already identified. Again, we talked about this before. He's seen as the new Moses. He says, Moses too gathered, again, Kahal, pitched the tent for the ark, officiated over sacrifices, and blessed the children of Israel. The installation of the ark at Zion, the place chosen by God for his name to dwell, marks the summation of the process begun with the completion of the tabernacle at Sinai. David's blessing of the people echoes Moses' blessing of the people because his establishment of the ark in Jerusalem marks the final conquest of the land promised to Abraham. David's extraordinary ritual feeding of all Israel, both women and men, in 1 Chronicles 16:3, we haven't got there yet, obviously, also associates him with the covenant banquet of Moses and the elders at Sinai and the manna in the wilderness, yet also with the promise of Deuteronomy that the people would one day eat in the presence of God in the place where God will choose to dwell. Also worth noting here that Han brings out is, so they bring out the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord with shouting to the sound of the horn and trumpet, so on and so forth. And Han, who is a Catholic, by the way, notes here that when the aged Elizabeth greets Mary, she exclaims, and here he has the Greek term in Luke 1:42. The Greek word is found only here in the New Testament and appears in the Greek Old Testament only in Chronicles descriptions of Levitical worship before the ark. So 1 Chronicles 15:28, 16:4 and 5, 42, 2 Chronicles 5:13. I feel like you can appreciate this without the full import of Catholicism if you're not a Catholic. Concerning David's dancing, and again, it's the InterVarsity Press's Bible commentary. They said, referring to dancing in the ancient world, much of the dancing that is attested in the ancient world takes place in cultic contexts. Though both Mesopotamia and Egypt sources frequently depict dancers involved in entertainment. The dancing connected to festivals would probably resemble folk dancing of today, featuring the coordinated movements of a group of dancers. At other times, the dancers could more resemble ballet, where a scene or drama is acted out. Single dancers usually performed either whirling, squatting, leaping, hopping type dances, or acrobatics approximating a modern gymnast's routine. Dancers sometimes performed either scantily clad or in the nude. In cultic contexts, the participating officials, i.e., the priest administration, at times danced, not just the professionals. In one Hittite ritual, this specifically included the queen, and I thought this was significant. There are no known examples of dancing kings. Of course, this would be the one. And then we'll close out here with Lightheart's commentary on this phrase that Michal, his wife, despised him in her heart. And the parallel in Samuel has a bit more of the interaction between them back and forth. They cut this out in the Chronicles account, but here Lightheart says, the chronicler's contrast of Saul and David continues to the end of chapter 15. David seeks God. Saul does not. David cares for the ark that Saul neglected. Saul's daughter, Michal, despises David's celebration, continuing in the tradition of her neglectful father. We recall that she was barren, in 2 Samuel 6 brings this up, marking an end of Saul's family. Because remember, Saul dies and all of his sons in that same battle in chapter 10. And then, of course, his daughter is barren. At some point, she dies. And so, therefore, the line of Saul is cut off at that point. And that is chapter 15.